75% of Americans would now vote for a gay person. That's a big change from 10 years ago.
Yep.
60% would vote for a Muslim. 58% would vote for an atheist. Socialist, 47. It's at the very bottom of the ballot. They hear socialist, they think herpes, Bernie.
Under Trump, the Congress voted for $1 trillion in tax breaks for the richest people in this country and the largest corporations. That's a giveaway. We just increased military spending with very little discussion, I don't know if you know this, by $80 billion. Military industrial complex.
Including the Democrats.
Pardon me?
The Democrats vote for it too.
Yes, absolutely correct. Absolutely right. All right.
But that's socialism, the military. That's crony socialism.
Well, that's
right?
Crony capitalism.
But the military isn't capitalism, that's the government.
No, but it's who owns the military industrial complex.
Let's be real. When Bill Maher goes after Bernie Sanders, sparks are inevitable. But this clash felt different. It wasn't a mild disagreement or a polite panel exchange. It was Maher staring straight at the core of Bernie's worldview and essentially saying, sure, this sounds great in a college dorm, but how does it actually work in the real world? That's what makes this conversation matter. It cuts right to a question people have been asking for years. Is Bernie offering real, workable solutions, or just a compelling vibe? Before diving deeper, imagine this as one of those debates where everyone's got an opinion, because it touches everything. Healthcare, immigration, taxes, and the broader direction of the country. What gives Maher's critique weight is his tone. He's not coming in like an over-the-top partisan voice shouting from the sidelines. Instead, he sounds like someone who agrees that America has serious problems. He acknowledges inequality, flaws in the healthcare system, and the reality of corporate greed. But then he pivots to a tougher point. Just because a problem is real doesn't mean every proposed solution is a good one. And that's where things get interesting. Bernie's political identity has always been rooted in moral clarity. His message is straightforward. The wealthy have too much power, working people are struggling, corporations exploit the system, healthcare costs are out of control, and politics is deeply influenced by money. On that level, a lot of people across the spectrum nod in agreement. Even those who wouldn't call themselves socialists can see that something isn't working. But agreement on the problem is the easy part. The harder question is, what happens next? That's where the energy in the room can shift. When it comes time to move from diagnosis to detailed solutions, the applause can start to fade. Take marijuana policy as an example. Bernie's stance is rooted in a moral argument many people find compelling. The war on drugs caused real harm, especially in minority communities, so those same communities should benefit first from legalization. On an emotional level, that resonates. But Maher's counter is more pragmatic. He argues that once policy starts prioritizing groups based on identity, the conversation shifts away from practical governance and toward cultural division. Instead of focusing on implementation, it risks triggering a broader culture war, and that's where, in his view, Democrats often stumble. And that tension, between moral intention and practical execution, is really the heart of the debate.
When he ran in 2020, Bernie Sanders said he would legalize marijuana on his first day as president, but that the business of selling pot would be awarded first to those who suffered most from the drug war. And you know what? I can't argue with that instinct. The drug war has been a horrendous instrument of prejudice and punishment for racial minorities. So it seems fair that they jumped the line for weed franchises the way Indians did for casinos. But it's also what's holding up Republican support for legalizing weed nationally, which would be good for everybody. And these are the hard, practical choices the Democrats have to weigh. Redress the past, or reach out to the gettable white voter who says, you know what, I'd like a shot at getting in the pot business.
Republicans thrive on that kind of fight. They don't just engage with it, they anticipate it. And that's the broader point Bill Maher keeps returning to. His argument is that Democrats often take ideas with wide public appeal and package them in ways that make them politically volatile. Legalizing marijuana, for example, already has broad support. But once it's framed through identity-based priorities, it can shift the conversation and hand opponents an easy line of attack. That's where the frustration comes in. The issue isn't just whether a policy is rooted in good intentions. It's whether it's built to succeed politically. In other words, are you trying to win and implement change? Or are you settling for moral satisfaction even if it costs you the outcome? Then there's healthcare. Bernie Sanders' strongest ground and most consistent message. Proposals like Medicare for all, single-payer systems, and universal coverage are presented as straightforward solutions to a system many people see as broken. In a country where medical bills can feel overwhelming, even predatory, that message resonates deeply. But Maher's counterargument hits at the core issue of feasibility. If this model is so clearly better, why hasn't it worked even in Vermont? Supporters of Bernie often push back on that point, arguing it oversimplifies the economic and political challenges involved. Still, as a political critique, it lands hard. Vermont isn't a deeply conservative state resistant to public programs. It's exactly the kind of place where such a system should, in theory, have the best chance to succeed. And yet, even there, financial realities became a serious obstacle. That's what gives the argument its edge. It shifts the debate from ideals to execution, from what sounds good to what actually holds up under real-world conditions.
For example, Bernie Sanders, his big thing was always bringing single-payer health care to our country of 340 million. But when liberal, tie-dyed Vermont tried to do it for a population of 626,000, it collapsed like that poor the Oval Office last week. Bernie, AOC, Mandani are not Democrats. They'll be the first to tell you that. They're democratic socialists, and that's a very different thing, and I don't think people know that.
So Maher's point is the one that really sticks. If a smaller-scale version already struggled, why should anyone assume a nationwide rollout would unfold smoothly, like everything just falls into place? That doesn't mean the current system gets a pass. No one seriously believes the American healthcare system is some model of efficiency. It's expensive, confusing, and full of distorted incentives that leave people frustrated and, often, financially strained. But Bill Maher's argument is sharper than just criticism. It's about scale and realism. Replacing a flawed system with something even larger and more complex isn't automatically a solution. Simply saying the government will cover everyone doesn't answer the harder questions. What about cost control? How do you manage hospital pricing? What happens to pharmaceutical profits? How do you streamline insurance bureaucracy? What incentives will doctors and providers actually respond to? Those aren't side details. They're the entire challenge. And that's where his critique of Bernie Sanders lands hardest. Without clear, detailed answers to those questions, the proposal starts to sound less like a fully developed plan and more like a powerful, but incomplete, promise.
They are suggesting if we move toward a Medicare for all single-payer program, which guarantees health care to all people, it would cost a lot of money. That's true. But what they forget to tell you is it would be much more cost-effective than the dysfunctional system we have right now, which is the most expensive per capita on earth.
But it couldn't even work in your home state of Vermont. They were going to institute it, and the governor said, it's going to cost too much money. We just can't do it. It would be the entire budget.
No, well...
That's true.
Well, that's not... I'm not the governor of the state of Vermont. I'm the senator from the state of Vermont.
And honestly, that's where Bernie Sanders loses a lot of people. There's little debate that he's effective at diagnosing the problem. Arguably, that's his strongest skill. He can clearly lay out what's broken and why it matters. But when it comes to the solution, critics often feel like the message shifts from specifics to faith, almost as if the details will fall into place once the larger political shift happens. And that's a tougher sell than it used to be. After years marked by inflation, economic pressure, immigration tensions, and a broader sense that institutions are already under strain, people are more skeptical of big, open-ended promises. There's a growing demand not just for bold ideas, but for clear, grounded plans that show exactly how those ideas would work in practice. That's really the gap being highlighted, between identifying the problem and proving that the solution can hold up in a messy, real-world system.
The question is, Bill, you tell me, why is it that every other major country on earth,
I will tell you why. Yeah. Because they control both ends of it. If you're saying that the government is going to pick up the tab, but not make the insurance companies, the hospitals, and the doctors not gouge people, right, then we are going to break the budget. It has to work both ways.
Exactly.
And, okay, so then
here's an example. So
you're going to make the hospitals do that? You're going to because that is
socialist. The United
socialist.
States is the only major country on earth that allows private insurance companies to make huge profits in the healthcare system.
Right.
The function of healthcare should be to provide quality care to all people, not to make huge profits of the drug companies.
Maher also zeroes in on the broader socialist label, and this is where the debate opens up even more. Bernie Sanders tries to reframe the term by pointing out that Americans already support programs with socialistic elements, like Social Security, Medicare, and veterans benefits. And to be fair, he's right, those programs are widely popular. But Bill Maher's pushback draws a sharper line. He essentially argues, people liking specific programs that help them doesn't automatically mean they want a full-scale ideological shift of the entire economy. That distinction is crucial. Many Americans are comfortable with targeted government support, a safety net for seniors, veterans, or people going through tough times. But that doesn't necessarily translate into support for sweeping, system-wide change, especially when it's framed in terms of class struggle or activist rhetoric. And this is where perception takes over. When some voters hear democratic socialism, they're not picturing efficient Nordic-style systems. They're thinking about heavy bureaucracy, economic stagnation, shortages, or losing personal control to distant decision-makers. Whether that perception is fair or not almost becomes secondary. Because in politics, branding isn't just important, it's everything.
Want to deal with the grotesque level of income and wealth inequality in America? Very few people think it is acceptable or moral that the top 0.1% owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. That we have seen a proliferate.
But see, Bernie, you always say that, and I think even the Republicans are not for income inequality. They hear that, but it doesn't compute that that's going to be solved by socialism. Socialism is the programs they already like. They like Social Security. That's socialism.
But they
like Medicare. They like the VA. They like the military.
No, that's exactly right.
It's already a socialist country.
Maher really drives that point home with one of his sharpest observations. Americans have become more open on a lot of social issues over time, but socialism still ranks near the bottom of their comfort zone. That contrast says a lot. In a country that's shifted significantly on culture and identity, that one label still makes many people uneasy. Supporters of Bernie Sanders often frame that as an education gap, as if people would come around if they better understood the policies behind the label. But Bill Maher flips that idea. Maybe it's not confusion. Maybe it's caution. Maybe voters hear the pitch and, rightly or wrongly, associate it with risks they're not willing to take. And that leads into another politically sensitive area. Immigration. Maher's broader critique is that parts of the activist left are drifting toward positions that, to many everyday voters, feel disconnected from reality. Whether it's messaging, tone, or specific policy proposals, his argument is that what sounds morally compelling within activist circles can come across as extreme, or even incoherent, to people outside that bubble. That gap between internal enthusiasm and external perception is where political support can quietly erode.
75% of Americans would now vote for a gay person. That's a big change from 10 years ago.
Yep.
60% would vote for a Muslim. 58% would vote for an atheist. Socialist, 47%. It's at the very bottom of the ballot. They hear socialist, they think herpes.
That word, normal, carries more weight than it gets credit for. It's not flashy or ideological, but it resonates because a lot of people feel worn out. They're tired of purity tests, constant outrage, and being told that every disagreement is a moral failing rather than a difference in perspective. What many voters seem to want is simpler: stability, clarity, and leadership that feels grounded in everyday reality. Not something that sounds like it was crafted in an academic bubble or an insular political circle. That's really the core of Bill Maher's critique. He's arguing that the country isn't craving more intensity or ideological escalation from either side. Instead, it's looking for leaders who come across as practical and steady, people focused on solving problems rather than amplifying divisions. In that framing, the appeal isn't about rejecting reform, it's about how that reform is delivered. Many voters want change, but not upheaval. They want compassion, but also order. They want fairness, without feeling like they need to adopt a dense or unfamiliar ideological framework just to be part of the conversation. And that tension between reform and restraint is where a lot of modern political debates are really being fought.
DSA are radicals about this concept, and radical economic policy is always ineluctably married to radical social policy. Their platform, for example, calls for completely open borders. They're for what Biden was doing, but more. You think you're going to win an election on that? This just seems like more extremism at a time when Americans are begging both parties, please, could just one of you act normal?
And this is where Bernie Sanders' biggest vulnerability comes into focus. He's incredibly effective at energizing people who already agree with him, the base that's ready for sweeping, structural change. But the real test isn't enthusiasm, it's expansion. Can he win over the skeptical middle? Can he make a suburban voter feel secure about big changes? Can he reassure a small business owner worried about costs and regulation? Can he connect with a parent concerned about safety, or a worker already feeling financially squeezed? Can he appeal to independents who distrust both parties? That's the hurdle. And critics argue that, at times, his tone leans more toward moral urgency than persuasion, more rallying the convinced than reaching the unconvinced. Meanwhile, Bill Maher is hammering a different argument: electability. His case is blunt. Voters aren't looking for a lecture, they're looking for competence. They're not asking for a sweeping ideological overhaul. They want a government that handles the basics effectively. In that view, what resonates isn't revolution, it's reassurance. Not a promise to tear everything down and rebuild from scratch, but a sense that things can work again without turning life upside down. And that's why the idea of normal carries so much weight. It might sound unremarkable, even dull, but for a lot of people, it represents stability, predictability, and a break from constant upheaval. Dismissing that desire can mean missing the core of what many voters are actually looking for right now.
Right.
Do the American people believe that the largest corporations and the wealthiest people who today are doing phenomenally well while the middle class shrinks, do people believe they should be asked to pay more in taxes? The American people say yes.
Okay. But, now this has been studied. The amount of tax revenue that we would get just from taxing the people who, I think your fans think you're talking about, the people who own a yacht, does not come close to covering what you want to pay for.
To be fair, Bernie Sanders does have a major advantage in these kinds of debates: sincerity. Even many critics acknowledge that he doesn't come across as scripted or artificial. He genuinely believes what he's saying, and in an era filled with polished talking points, focus group messaging, and performative empathy, that authenticity carries real weight. But sincerity, by itself, isn't a complete argument. People can fully believe in an idea and still be wrong about it. History is full of well-intentioned policies that produced unintended or even harmful outcomes because the underlying assumptions didn't hold up in practice. That's why the pushback from Bill Maher matters in this context. His critique isn't focused on intent, it's focused on feasibility. He's essentially asking, do these ideas actually work when they meet real-world constraints like budgets, incentives, and administrative complexity? That's where many broad political promises run into trouble. Saying the wealthy should pay more is a widely shared sentiment. But treating that idea as a limitless funding source, capable of supporting expansive programs without trade-offs, inefficiencies, or unintended effects, ignores how systems behave at scale. Governments don't automatically become more efficient just because they have more resources. In some cases, larger systems introduce new layers of bureaucracy, reduce accountability, and make outcomes harder to manage, not easier. That's the tension at the heart of Maher's argument. Good intentions and compelling narratives still have to survive contact with practical reality.
Under Trump, the Congress voted for $1 trillion in tax breaks for the richest people in this country and the largest corporations. That's a giveaway. We just increased military spending with very little discussion, I don't know if you know this, by $80 billion. Military industrial complex.
Including the Democrats.
Pardon me?
The Democrats vote for it too.
Yes, absolutely correct. Absolutely right. All right.
But that's socialism, the military. That's crony socialism.
Well, that's
right?
Crony capitalism.
But the military isn't capitalism, that's the government.
No, but it's who owns the military industrial complex.
And that's another point many people hesitate to say out loud. Government waste is real. Mismanagement happens. Large projects go over budget, underdeliver, or fail altogether. These concerns aren't abstract. They're part of why some voters are skeptical when sweeping new responsibilities are proposed. So when Bernie Sanders argues for expanding the role of government, critics naturally ask a straightforward question. If the system already struggles with efficiency and accountability, why should we expect better outcomes at a larger scale? At the same time, there's an important nuance in Bernie's message that even some critics acknowledge. He consistently challenges corporate welfare, excessive military spending, and policies that favor well-connected interests. On those points, he overlaps with criticisms heard across the political spectrum. Many people agree that cronyism exists, that political influence can shape outcomes, and that taxpayer money is sometimes spent in ways that don't serve the public effectively. But pointing out flaws in the current system is only part of the equation. That's where Bill Maher's broader challenge comes in. Highlighting problems, corruption, inequality, inefficiency, doesn't automatically validate a proposed solution. Critique and replacement are two different things. Bernie tends to frame the issue in terms of justice. The system is unfair and needs to be fundamentally corrected. Maher, on the other hand, emphasizes consequences. Any alternative must be evaluated based on how it performs under real-world constraints like incentives, budgets, political realities, and human behavior. For many voters, that distinction is decisive. It's not just about whether a vision sounds morally compelling. It's about whether it can function in practice without creating new problems that are just as serious, or worse than the ones it's meant to solve.
It's either defund the police or military in the streets. Either MAGA's crypto crony capitalism or city-run grocery stores. No, I don't want that. I want a Democrat who reassures me if you like your Whole Foods, you can keep your Whole Foods. Governor-elect Spanberger once said about Biden's presidency that, quote, nobody elected him to be FDR. They elected him to be normal. Normal! You know, at this year's DSA convention, or as it's commonly known, Comic-Con. Get this, you had to submit a photo of a negative COVID test to get in. In 2025. Yeah, no one wants to do that again.
Because here's the truth. Most voters aren't chasing utopia. They're looking for relief. They want everyday concerns addressed in a way that feels practical and manageable. Affordable groceries, safer communities, accessible healthcare, sensible immigration policies, and schools focused on education rather than ideological debates. They also want leaders who don't treat every disagreement as a crisis. When politics drifts too far into abstract moral arguments or constant ideological framing, many people begin to disengage. That's part of why the critique from Bill Maher resonates with some observers. It's less about opposing a single figure and more about cautioning a broader political approach. The underlying message is a reminder not to mistake enthusiastic reactions from a specific audience for widespread national agreement. In that sense, the argument isn't just directed at Bernie Sanders or any one individual. It's aimed at a style of politics that assumes strong messaging alone can translate into broad support. The warning is that popular ideas within certain circles still have to be tested against the priorities and concerns of the wider electorate. At the same time, Bernie's impact on the political landscape is undeniable. He helped push issues like inequality, healthcare access, and corporate influence into mainstream discussion in ways that forced broader attention and debate. But shifting the conversation is different from securing consensus on solutions. That's where Maher's central challenge lands. Not in dismissing concerns, but in demanding clarity. How would a proposal function in practice? How would it be funded, managed, and sustained? What mechanisms ensure accountability? And what happens when theoretical plans meet real-world constraints? Those are the kinds of questions that often determine whether ideas move from discussion to implementation. In the end, while passion can inspire movements and urgency can drive attention, voters tend to prioritize what feels stable, workable, and grounded in reality when it comes time to decide.